Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trust and Trade, a podcast produced by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Trust and Trade is a podcast for seasoned practitioners interested in deep dives into the areas of competition, consumer protection, and privacy law, and casual listeners who want to better understand how these laws are enforced. Each episode is presented by one of the specialty committees within the section. I'm your host, Anant, Raut. This episode is part of our ongoing Mergernomics series, produced and co-hosted by the Mergers and Acquisitions Committee of the Antitrust Law Section. The purpose of the series is to demystify the economic analyses that enforcers use in analyzing a merger and determining whether it should be blocked. Each episode in this series focuses on one of the major economic tools, tests, or analyses used in merger. Today's episode is on vertical math. Joining me today as my co-host is Emily Cotton, a managing principal at economic consulting firm Analysis Group. She has an extensive background in conducting complex quantitative and qualitative analysis. Emily, you got to have both.
Definitely. Can't do quantitative without the qualitative.
Can't have one without the other. Quantitative and qualitative analyses of data in merger matters as well as litigation. So, hello, Emily.
Hi, Anant. How are you?
I'm good. Who's our guest today?
Our guest is Dr. Craig Malam. He is a principal at Cornerstone Research. He has spent 2 decades of experience working on mergers, merger investigations, and related litigations, including several years as a senior economic advisor at the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, otherwise known as the ACCC.
Hi, Emily. Great to be here. Hi, Anant.
Thanks so much, Craig. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Me too.
How about you?
Me too. I love vertical math.
Vertical math is an extremely exciting topic. So, Craig, can you tell us what is vertical math?
Yes, I can. So vertical math is a tool that can be used to study the risk of foreclosure in vertical mergers.
We all know about mergers. We know about M&A. What is a vertical merger?
So a vertical merger is when 2 or more companies, usually typically just 2, that produce separate services or components along the same supply chain decide to merge. It's helpful to think of vertical mergers in contrast to horizontal mergers where, companies are selling the same or substantially similar products and services, and they may be competing in the same market. In contrast, a vertical merger brings together 2 producers of largely distinct products or services, but they may be vertically related, i.e., one of these may be an input into the production of the other. And so there may be some competitive implications from the merger.
Got it. So I'm thinking through, some of the big mergers we've had in, the U.S. in the past couple of years. And it seems like one example of a vertical merger could be the Microsoft Activision merger. I think that merger happened sometime late last year, and I'm pretty sure that they won approval from foreign regulators, and then there was a preliminary injunction or something along those lines from the FTC. I think the FTC is continuing to challenge this merger, and I'm, guessing maybe that could be a real-world merger we could all talk about too. Does that sound like an interesting one to kind of thread through this conversation, Craig, as we learn more about vertical math?
Yeah, absolutely. So this merger is viewed as vertical because Activision is the video game developer, and those video games viewed as an input that Microsoft needs to successfully produce the Xbox and its subscription and streaming services. It would be a horizontal merger, on the other hand, if video games were somehow substitutes for the game consoles, but they're not. Potential competitive significance of vertical mergers comes from the fact that one feature people consider when buying an Xbox or a subscription or streaming service is what set of games they will have access to. So having a popular line of products available for your console or service drives customers to your product. And currently, Activision produces for a variety of different console platforms, produces games like, the most famous one I think is Call of Duty 6 Black Ops, released later this year, will be available on Xbox, PlayStation, and Windows.
Great example. I will admit I am not a Call of Duty player myself. Are you, Craig?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Well, so at least now we've got a good example that hopefully a lot of other people have firsthand experience with. So, I know in antitrust, a concept that we're always talking about is foreclosure. And foreclosure is a form of anti-competitive harm. How does that relate to vertical mergers, and how does that kind of involve vertical math?
Right. So foreclosure is one of those terms that there's a few other terms around that are used in place of it. But basically, it means that foreclosure is occurring if competing rivals are closed out from access to a needed supplier or in some cases, a buyer. So this could occur if an upstream firm decides to limit or withdraw access to the input by downstream firms. And because the downstream firms need that input to compete with the downstream operations of the upstream firm. So foreclosure is a potential harm from a vertical merger if the downstream competitive effects of that decision about inputs is introduced into the calculus of the upstream firm by the merger. So in other words, the combined firm may find it profitable to close off access to the downstream firm in order to benefit the downstream party.
So is it fair to say that that's what the FTC is alleging could happen after a merger between Microsoft and Activision? The FTC is alleging that Microsoft could attempt to foreclose access to Activision's games in order to drive business to the Xbox platform or game subscription services. And if that's the case, what would that look like?
That's right. It could take a variety of forms. The one that FTC alleged concerned Microsoft making Activision's Call of Duty version exclusive, which means that you can only play it on the Xbox and not, for example, the PlayStation. And Microsoft might, under this theory, might benefit from this because this would increase sales of the Xbox consoles by driving customers to the Xbox in order to be able to play Call of Duty. There might be some players who really love Call of Duty and will buy an Xbox only to play Call of Duty. Other players might be affected more at the margins. They would previously have been indifferent between a PlayStation and an Xbox, but they might choose an Xbox. So at the same time, under this theory, there's also an obvious cost in that if Microsoft did this, it would reduce the amount of money Activision earns by selling on other platforms like the PlayStation.
Are there other types of foreclosure that could take place here too? I know sometimes we talk about non-traditional forms of foreclosure.
Yeah, there's a range of things, as you can imagine, that could have a concern about. And so some examples might be that in this example that multiple games could be withdrawn from other platforms, making them available only through Microsoft's subscription or streaming services. And another theory might be that Microsoft not entirely refused to deal with competitors, but might instead just raise prices to these other competitors. And that's sometimes called partial foreclosure.
And Emily and Craig, what I find interesting about foreclosure as a concept is that this is often found in the absence of actual statements by the companies or documents indicating that this is why we're going to go ahead with the merger. This is just after you merge, there may be this incentive to change how you operate in the market, which is where this analysis comes in.
Absolutely. We're trying with our econ crystal balls to forecast the way this will all play out. So Craig, now that we've set up the context for what, where, and why vertical math might be useful, if we're thinking about kind of a vertical merger as a merger between two firms within the same supply chain, and we're thinking about this idea of potential foreclosure, how does one actually do the vertical math to evaluate whether or not there's an anti-competitive incentive here to refuse to deal or to kind of withhold supply from your rivals?
Vertical math is actually way simpler than it sounds. It is a way to estimate the potential for the transaction to create an incentive to foreclose. So one calculates an estimate of the profit that the merged firm could achieve from supplying all downstream competitors, and this is the no foreclosure or status quo scenario. And then we also calculate an equivalent or comparable profit from supplying no downstream competitors. In other words, withdrawing that input from any other downstream competitors and just supplying the merging party's downstream firm.
So, Craig, that does sound fairly simple in the extreme example, which I think is often the case in economics, right? Economic theory and tests can tell us how to do things when the world kind of plays out perfectly. But what about the instances where we think there may be some form of partial foreclosure or non-traditional foreclosure? How do we think about those scenarios?
Right. So partial foreclosure is the simplest example to think about is really just raising the price to the downstream competing firm. So rather than completely cutting them off or setting a price equal to much higher than anybody's prepared to pay, it's just raising the price and disadvantaging those downstream competitors. And there's actually more than just raising the price. There's a range of potential partial foreclosure strategies, and it will usually require very specific assumption, and it depends on the circumstances. But one thing that's generally true, however, is that if the vertical math indicates that total foreclosure is profitable, then partial foreclosure strategies, if any are available, are likely to be even more profitable. So if instead total foreclosure is not likely to be profitable, then partial foreclosure strategies of all kinds are not strictly ruled out. So, this is a sense in which vertical math is used as a screen rather than necessarily creating precise estimates of the total profit outcomes. Under a range of plausible assumptions, it would be, if it would be unprofitable to foreclose, the investigator can consider whether other partial strategies may be available, and if none seem likely, the risk of foreclosure is deemed to be low. If, on the other hand, the vertical math finds it could be profitable, then it's an indication that, we should investigate further.
So I think vertical math is like an equation. Every good equation needs inputs. What are the key inputs we need to do this vertical math?
Right. So there's a few inputs, but it's fairly simple. And as I've outlined, we're really just comparing these foreclosure and no foreclosure scenarios. So we need profit margins earned by the downstream firms as well as the upstream firms. We need sales by each of the merging parties. And then the other thing we need is a diversion ratio between the downstream firms. So this is the percentage of sales lost by the downstream rival. So the rival being, under the foreclosure scenario, it's the firm that the upstream firm either raises the price to or cuts off completely. So the percentage of sales lost by that downstream firm that are recaptured as sales by the downstream merger party. So we won't go into detail here about diversion ratios and how to calculate those, but there's another podcast by Joanna Chai and Carla Hine with information on how to estimate diversion.
All right, so I get the inputs that we need, but how do we actually do this calculation? Is that complicated as well, or is that something non-economists can kind of think through?
I think non-economists can think through. There's some basic pieces. The equation to calculate vertical math just pulls together these different pieces and compares the profit with no foreclosure to the profit with foreclosure. So to calculate the profit with no foreclosure, that consists of the profit on sales by the upstream merger party and the profit on sales by the downstream merger party. So to calculate those profits, you take the upstream profit margin multiplied by sales to all downstream firms, because we're in the no foreclosure scenario. And then the downstream merger party's profit margin multiplied by their sales. So next, if we want to calculate the profit with foreclosure, this is the profit on upstream sales, but only to the downstream merging party because you've foreclosed all those other downstream competitors. And then, of course, the profit on downstream sales, but potentially to a larger customer base. The upstream profit margin multiplied by the sales it makes only to the downstream merger party. That's easy. And then we have the profit for the downstream firm is the downstream profit margin multiplied by the sales made by the downstream merging party, which could now be larger. And so that estimate for how much larger those downstream sales are is the downstream sales the merger party was already making, plus these diverted sales from the foreclosed competitors, or these recaptured sales. So those additional sales may be estimated using the diversion ratio, and then we multiply that ratio by the sales that the non-merging downstream competitors were making before the foreclosure.
So it sounds like we're just kind of comparing these two profits in two different states of the world, and kind of one with foreclosure, one without. And then we're also, getting the opportunity to use lots of other fun economic concepts like diversion ratios that people can learn about in other podcasts in this series. Is that right?
That's right. So it's just the math itself is putting those pieces together, and it's a simple equation or an inequality comparing those two profit totals under the two scenarios.
Great. So maybe it's helpful to walk everyone through a simple example where we use some real hard numbers and kind of walk through the math.
Sure. So let's suppose that the downstream and upstream firms each earn a 10% profit margin. And let's say the upstream firm makes sales of $10 million to downstream rivals, which downstream rivals use to produce $20 million worth of goods. And so also suppose the downstream rivals have no alternative if the upstream firm doesn't supply them. And if foreclosed, if the upstream firm doesn't supply them, they would exit the market and 100% of their sales would go to the downstream merging party. Then the profit, if the merged firm continues to sell to rivals, is 10% of $10 million or $1 million. The profit if you foreclose is 10% of 20 million or 2 million. And so because 2 million is larger than 1 million, the math indicates that an incentive to foreclose might be created by the merger under these assumptions. If we think, however, that there is a lot of downstream competition so that the diversion ratio isn't 100%, but it's 25%, in that case, the merged firm recaptures only 25% of that 2 million or $500,000. And in that case, the math would not indicate an incentive to foreclose.
So Craig, I love numbers. I'm an economist. You're an economist. But I think real world examples make this a lot more entertaining for probably the lawyers that are listening on this podcast. So why don't we go back to our Microsoft Activision example? The FTC is currently suing to stop the now consummated merger, alleging that Microsoft could attempt to foreclose access to Activision's games and potentially drive business to its Xbox console from that of competing consoles. How would you use vertical math to assess that specific claim?
Sure. So maybe to simplify things, and I agree with you, let's get into a real world example. It's probably easy to simplify if we suppose that just the only interest or concern is particularly in whether Microsoft would want to make Call of Duty version exclusive, as we mentioned before. So you can only play it on the Xbox and not, for example, the PlayStation. So to do the vertical math, we would need an estimate of the Call of Duty sales Activision is currently making to other platforms. We would need an estimate of the likely diversion of PlayStation consoles that would be recaptured as Xbox sales. And so, if you think about these ingredients, the estimate of current sales is straightforward and can be easily found in financial documents. The estimate of Call of Duty sales Xbox would recapture is going to require some economic estimation. These numbers are the diversion ratios, and as we mentioned, there's another podcast where you can learn all about diversion ratios. Once you've run those numbers, it might be very obvious that there would or there would not be an incentive there. If the math indicated no incentive for Microsoft to foreclose, then the investigator would consider whether any partial foreclosure strategies could be likely. If the vertical math suggests that total foreclosure would be profitable, then the investigator is likely to continue past this initial screen and assess other factors that may be relevant, such as other profit motives and strategies that might exist in addition to or separately from those considered under this profitability trade-off. One might also consider whether there are feasible remedies to mitigate this risk, such as the ones that the court took into consideration when denying the FTC's preliminary injunction last July.
Great. That's a really helpful context of kind of how to think through the various incentives that the two parties might have. And I think a helpful way of kind of summing this up. So before we hit the end of our podcast here, I'm wondering if we can talk about other economic tests and how they relate to vertical math. I think we've had a really great series of podcasts here that have talked through a bunch of these tests. Diversion ratios is something we've already discussed. I know there was a podcast on guppies and some other, really useful tools that kind of come into play in mergers. And could you kind of put vertical math in that broader context to me of when I want to be thinking about vertical math as a practitioner versus when I want to be using some of those other tools?
Sure. So I think the best way to put it in context is really to think about vertical math as a screen. So it's an initial look, and it's part of getting to know the transaction really and thinking about pros and the cons of a given transaction. And vertical math, a little bit like a HHI, is just one of those initial things that you would calculate. So in comparison to guppies, for example, there is a V guppy, in fact, which calculates the price pressure that might be created by a vertical transaction. There's a few different V guppies, but one of them is comparable to what we've been thinking about here, which is V guppy and the incentive to raise prices to the downstream firm. The V guppy is really scoring that price pressure and is really estimating a more specific likely effect rather than representing an initial screen. Another tool that is going to be talked about in this series is think about bargaining leverage in the context of vertical mergers. And so this approach applies in cases where input prices might be subject to bargaining between the upstream supplier and the downstream firms. And in these cases, the approach involves thinking about how the merger will change each party's outside option and bargaining leverage. So a little bit different to straight vertical math. And a bargaining leverage model was used in AT&T Time Warner, a very prominent example. And then finally, another alternative, which will also be the subject of another podcast with Ted Rosenbaum and Virginie Kahn, is full-blown merger simulation. So a merger simulation allows, where the data exists, economists to conduct an accurate and effective simulation of a merger. And this is really one of the most effective and comprehensive ways to assess the likely competitive effects from a given merger. And the general idea is to fully model out how demand and supply work in the relevant market, and then prediction about how the transaction changes things. It's complicated and expensive, and it requires more time to do, but obviously very, very effective. And so vertical math is nowhere near a full-blown merger simulation, which is kind of the more extensive and closer look at the likely effects of a vertical transaction, whereas vertical math is a screen, as I said earlier.
So it sounds like vertical math is, something helpful to take into account when you're kind of first assessing a vertical merger, but maybe isn't going to provide you with kind of a slam dunk answer in all cases about the relative competitiveness or anti-competitiveness that we would kind of see coming out of that merger. Is that a fair assessment? Right.
So it's an initial screen, and so obviously as an initial screen it has certain benefits, but then it has disadvantages compared to some of these alternatives. One disadvantage is that vertical math is generally taking price levels as given, and obviously we know that price changes can happen post-merger. Accounting for these types of changes requires something more like bargaining leverage or a merger simulation. And it can be criticized as being oversimplified. Often it is a more simpler version, but it can often get you to the same place you'd get with a full merger simulation, but with less work and time involved. If used as a screen, that degree of simplification might be appropriate. And then a final is that vertical math can overestimate how easy foreclosure could be. So if an upstream supplier has a dominant market share but a low profit share, The vertical math can sometimes show there is a high incentive to foreclose. However, in this case, one would need to think carefully about why that upstream supplier has a low profit share. This is because a low upstream profit share could be evidence that downstream buyers would respond to foreclosure by purchasing substantially less from the dominant supplier and presumably more from rivals. Otherwise, the dominant supplier would have already raised the pre-merger price in the first place.
Well, I appreciate this last segment in particular for those of us who are not economists, but assiduously listening to this Mergernomics series to understand these concepts better. It helps to understand whether these are all, for lack of a better term, substitutable products, or whether you use them at different points in the analysis when you're doing a merger review. So Emily, Craig, we'd like to end these podcasts with some key takeaways for practitioners. Craig, why don't we start with you? What would be a key takeaway for you?
I think the key takeaway is that vertical math is used in vertical mergers, obviously, and that's a merger between two firms on the same supply chain. And when one is concerned about potential foreclosure, and foreclosure is, an anti-competitive refusal to deal with rivals or otherwise anti-competitively favor the downstream merging party. Vertical math involves estimating the merged firm's profit if it forecloses rivals and compares it against the profit of continuing to serve the rivals. Any other thoughts for our audience, Emily?
I think that's a great summary, Craig. The only things I would add is I think that, vertical math is providing indicative evidence of potential foreclosure. But as we just discussed in that last section, it's not the only piece of evidence, even the only piece of economic evidence we're going to produce in any sort of litigation or merger case. And I think it needs to be put in that broader context of other, quantitative economic tests, and then, of course, always the qualitative evidence that goes along with whatever case we're building as well.
Thank you, Emily, Dr. Craig Malam, and the Mergers and Acquisitions Committee for another stellar episode in our ongoing Mergernomics series. To our listeners, be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, and we'll see you next time on Trust and Trade.